Welcome and thank you all for joining the National Center for Rural Road Safety's November webinar entitled Addressing Behavioral Highway Safety Issues on Rural Roads, a look at the new GHSA report. A few logistics as we get started. First, my name is Jamie Sullivan. I'm the director of the National Center for Rural Road Safety. And again, I'd like to welcome you here today. Our webinar will be an hour-and-a-half long. Closed captioning is available. The link is available both on the slide as well as in the chat pod. And we did email it to anyone who requested it last night. We are recording our webinar and it will be posted on our website within a week under ruralsafetycenter.org/webinar-archive. Additionally, we will be using the Q&A or question pod today. Any questions that you have for our presenters, if you'd please put those in that pod. You can do it at any time. We're going to stop twice for questions for our presenters today. Additionally, you can put any technical difficulties or questions you may have for the center in that pod as well, and I will answer them as our presenters are going. The chat pod, you can feel free to have discussions in there. Additionally, we do have the handout available for download. You can find that over on your right-hand side. Following today's webinar, there will be a survey that will pop up. Please feel free to fill that out. At the end of it, we do ask if there are any additional topics you'd like us to address. We're starting to work through the webinar topics that we'll have in January and throughout the spring. So if there's any burning desires you have, please go ahead and put those in the survey for us. And then certificates of completion and the application for CEUs will be emailed to you within a couple of weeks. Just a few clarifications on the application for CEUs that you receive. The CEUs themselves are free for all of you to obtain. However, if you want an actual transcript from the university documenting those, the fee will be $25 to you. If a letter saying that you have those CEUs is sufficient, then again, there is no fee. And you can request that letter from the same email address that you send the CEU form to. Additionally, the forms, as we have been sending them out, do request your Social Security number. You only need to provide the last 4 digits of that, and that's just so that they can make you a student in the Montana State University system. Again, just the last 4, and we've asked them to update the form so that it will be a little bit less confusing for everybody. Today's presenters, we have 3 presenters with us today. We have Pam Fisher, who's the Senior Director of External Engagement for the Governor's Highway Safety Association. Pam has nearly 40 years of experience addressing behavioral safety issues at the local, state, and national level. In her role at GHSA, she manages many of the association's partnerships, provides guidance to the state highway safety offices to promote best practice, and works to bring national visibility to highway safety through outreach, public speaking, and national reports. Our second speaker for today will be Andy Bill. She is the Associate Director of Traffic Operations and Safety Laboratory, as well as the Director of Transportation Information Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her current research incorporates aspects from traffic operations and traffic safety with a specific emphasis on discovering new and innovative ways to address traffic crashes. And lastly, we're going to hear from Pete Abrams, who is the Law Enforcement Liaison for the Wyoming Department of Transportation Highway Safety Office. He has been a certified peace officer in Wyoming for 33 years, first with the Natrona County Sheriff's Office and then with the Casper Police Department. Before retiring in 2014, he supervised Casper's Traffic Enforcement and Special Events Unit. He then brought his extensive law enforcement and traffic safety experience to the state's Highway Safety Office, where he helped establish Wyoming's first law enforcement liaison program. And we're very excited to have all 3 of them here today to talk about the findings of the report and some of the case studies that are in it. Our goal for the webinar today is that once you've completed it, you'll have an understanding of the findings of that Governor Highway Safety Association report that was funded by State Farm, and it's entitled America's Rural Roads, Beautiful and Deadly. And our learning outcomes for today are for you to identify rural road crash statistics and leading crash causation factors, to understand unique challenges faced by rural areas, to describe examples of proven countermeasures and promising practices used in rural areas, to identify how Wisconsin's data portal and community mapping feature can be used in rural communities to identify traffic safety problems and inform resource allocation, And lastly, to describe how the Law Enforcement Liaison Program engages rural LELs to decrease rural fatalities. And with that, I am extremely excited to hand over today's presentation to Pam.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you so much for the invitation to share some of the key findings from the report. GHSA was very honored to partner with State Farm. We've had a long time partnership with the folks at State Farm, and I have to add a note of trivia as a shout out to our partners at State Farm. This is the 100th anniversary of the insurance company, and they started as a provider of insurance products to the agricultural community. So this report, their partnership with us to do this report, is very near and dear to their hearts, thinking about how that organization was founded 100 years ago. So we thank them for their support and their ongoing partnership. So I'm going to take some time to walk us through some of the key findings in the report, particularly looking at the data side, what we discovered. I'm going to talk about the challenges associated with rural roads, from a cultural perspective and some other areas. I'm going to talk about how we pull the safe system approach into this and really leverage it. A little bit on countermeasures, and then I'm going to invite Andy and Pete to jump in here and share some of their insights specific to areas that I'm going to focus on. So let me advance the slide and see if that's going to work. There we go. It's a beautiful thing. So we worked in partnership with the research firm Toxel, which is a Virginia-based organization. Their data analysts and one of their senior scientists worked with us to really get a handle on what we know from the FARS data for 2016 through 2020. We also surveyed the 57 state and territorial highway safety offices to really get a sense of what they were focusing on. And if you're not familiar with the work at GHSA, we represent the state highway safety offices that are tasked with the behavioral safety aspects, those things that we do out there, the decisions we make that are a factor in many of the crashes that occur. So we surveyed the states to find out how they were addressing rural populations. And what we discovered, and this is not an indictment of the states as much as just an understanding, is that rural populations are underserved. And that's because how we have been addressing roadway safety has not necessarily been segmented by urban or rural roads and communities. So when the state highway safety offices do an educational initiative, it's usually a statewide initiative and doesn't necessarily get to addressing some of those things that would be more specific to urban versus rural. So it is an equity issue as well. And we all know that this is an area that we must be focused on in our nation if we're going to serve all populations. So let me dig into the data a little bit and share this with you. As I said, I have a bunch of slides, but I'll move through them pretty quickly. So what the researchers at Toxel uncovered in looking at the FARS data was that about 45% of our traffic deaths occur on rural roads, but only 19% of the population lives in rural areas. So when we compare rural and urban crashes, we don't expect them to be evenly divided. But clearly, from what you can see here, we have an overrepresentation in rural roads thinking about the population size. And it begs the question, why? Is it driving longer distances? What's going on? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. We also looked at it from the perspective of vehicle miles traveled, and we do know that rural residents have to drive longer distances. Things are further apart, right? That's just the nature of our towns in those areas. But when we look at crashes by mile driven, excuse me, let me go back to that slide and got a little ahead of myself there. When we look at crashes by miles driven, each mile driven on a rural road is more likely to result in a crash than a mile driven on an urban roadway. So we need to think about also, how do these crashes happen? What are the contributing factors in this? So let me dig a little bit deeper. And I remind you too that, as you can see, red is rural, the black or dark blue is urban, and we're gonna use similar colors here as I go forward. So we know that motor vehicle occupants, people in cars, trucks, passenger vehicles are more likely to die on rural roads than urban. And looking at that in comparison to other modes, that's clearly the case, as you can see from the graph. And not surprisingly, pedestrians and bicyclists are killed in urban areas more predominantly than they are in rural areas. And it's really because of the mix of modes. You're more likely to have people on foot, people on bicycles, and other, micromobility devices, scooters and so forth in those urban areas. So the preponderance of folks who are killed in these urban crashes are people in passenger vehicles and also trucks as well. Thinking about just in terms of vehicle type, this will give you a greater breakdown on this. So you can, and I keep advancing and I apologize for that. I have to watch, I'm hovering over my mouse so that I can move forward quickly, but it's clearly jumping ahead of me a little bit. But as you can see, light trucks, we know that pickup trucks are very commonly used in rural communities, and also passenger vehicles. But I also point to large trucks where you can see definitely a big difference there. The large trucks, it's more likely those crashes are happening, those fatal crashes are happening on rural roadways. When we look at gender or sex, what we find is that, and this is not surprising at all, but men outnumber women by more than 2 to 1, just as they do in urban crashes. And we know overall, looking at traffic fatalities, that men are more likely to be involved in those. They're more likely to engage in risky behaviors than women are, and that's just the nature of how it is. Also, we looked at ethnicity. And again, the numbers are very clear here. You can see that individuals who are white account for the greatest number of those killed in rural crashes, but American Indian and Alaska Natives are more likely to be killed on rural than urban roads. And I think, that's pretty obvious as to why. So it is, we talked about equity issues before, and we clearly see here that when we think about Alaska Native, American Indian folks, we need to be mindful of their safe access in these areas, because that's where they predominantly are being killed. We also looked at the causation factors. This was important to understand what are those things that are really causing the problems here. And I want to talk for just a minute about, the high rate of crashes on rural roads are caused by a combination of factors. We think of things like safety resources, a lack of safety resources, simpler roadway infrastructure, poor emergency medical services, or just the distance to transport somebody from the scene of a crash to a trauma center, for instance. We know all of these have a significant impact on safety. But our focus from the State Highway Safety Office is on the behavioral side. So we did look at risky driving behaviors. And I want to point out too that we also looked at road configuration, and we know that many fatal crashes are happening on straight sections of roadway. So all these factors are at play, but this report specifically digs into the behavioral side because of the work we do in the highway safety offices. So when we think about what are those leading behavioral factors, the number one issue is seatbelt use, occupant restraint, and it is absolutely a hallmark of rural road crashes. Over half the people killed in these crashes were unrestrained. And I can't overstate how critical this is. I mean, I know I'm speaking to the choir here when we talk about the life-saving value of seatbelts, but clearly this is a message that we have to focus on in rural communities, recognizing the numbers. So let me address a couple more factors here. Let me see if I can get this to move forward. Here we go. Alcohol. Alcohol was number 2 when you think about those factors, and we clearly saw that it is something that is impacting the safety of folks on the road. We also recognize, however, that we not only need to think about impairment from the standpoint of alcohol, but we also need to think about it, and I'm trying to get my mouse to move here. Hang on one second. We also need to think about it from the standpoint of drugs. We've seen this huge uptick in the involvement of drugs in fatal crashes on our roads all across the country. But we are challenged by this because we know that there has not been significant testing associated with this. We need to do more testing to understand the extent of this problem. So when you look at this compared rural urban, you can clearly see it's problematic in both areas. So we do need to focus on doing more testing. If we're going to truly, have an impact on impairment caused by all kinds of drugs, not just alcohol, we've got to do more testing, and that's an area that we focus on for sure in the report. Another factor is speeding. This is kind of the graphs may be a little complicated, but what you need to understand is that fatal crashes that involve very high speeds tend to occur on rural roads, and rural roads again are the ones in red, rather than their urban counterparts, and particularly speeds above 100 miles per hour. And we all know what happened during the pandemic when we saw this huge drop in traffic on our roadways, both in urban areas, suburban areas, and out in rural communities. Some folks saw the open roadway and said, I'm going to put my foot, down on the gas pedal and see how fast we can get this thing to go. So, but we clearly saw this in those rural areas in particular. And that's really not surprising when you think as traffic volumes have come back, you think about the density of vehicles, other modes in urban areas, also thinking about road design. There are more intersections, there's signals and so forth. So, speed is a huge problem in this area, and it's not just necessarily on interstates or local roads. It's really on all these roadways, as you can see from the graph. When we looked at the data, what we found is that speed is a known factor in 27% of rural road fatalities, but when we looked only at fatalities and crashes that involved speeding, it was 46% of those that occurred on rural roads. So it is a huge problem and one that we have to get a handle on. I want to also talk for a minute about speed limits and what's happening. Higher speed limits, and again, this is not something that, I think would surprise anybody. Higher speed limits, maximum speed limits appear to be associated with higher rates of rural road fatalities per 100,000 state population. And the relationship varies, but the overall trend confirms that really speeding unnecessarily claims lives. And there's been a lot of research done on this since the maximum speed limit was raised many, many years ago. And I'm going to date myself when I do remember that we had the 55 mile per hour speed limit that went into effect in the 1970s, and the rates ever since have been going up. We looked at the states with the top 12 fatality rates per capita, and 10 have maximum speed limits of at least 70 miles per hour, and 2 of those 10 have the highest maximum speed limits of 80 miles per hour. So we do have to think about this, and we know quite clearly that when there is a crash, the higher the rate of speed, the more likely that the individuals inside that vehicle are going to sustain significant, probably life-threatening injuries. So we do have to think about speed limit setting and its impact. And, this is an issue that's really, this is addressed at the state houses, but, all of us working in safety, I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are conveying to our state legislatures as they are talking about this issue, hey, we know that speed, the impacts of speed have a significant effect on our fatalities out there on the roadway. So we need to educate as much as possible so that we have sound public policy around this issue. The other thing we found, we looked at age, and age is a factor. Inexperience is a factor in terms of causation. And we think about teens and young adults, and I'm talking young adults up to about the age of 24. I've worked in the highway safety business for a long, long time. I've spent a lot of time working on young driver issues. And what we know for a fact is that, not only is it inexperience for young drivers, but it's also immaturity. The brain doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. So, this is a factor in crashes, and it's even more predominant or more prominent, I should say, in rural areas. So we know young people are at a particular risk. It doesn't end when they turn 18 or leave their teen years. So we really have to resist the temptation to focus only on teens. We have to think about all young adults, as I said, that group up to age 24. And the overrepresentation is pretty significant. Nearly all states put licensing restrictions in place to address the risk for drivers under age 18, but that danger to those over 18 is even more disproportionate based on what we looked at. And so the one point I want to make here is that, rural communities lose their young people to out-migration. We know that that's happened. Young people go off to college, they get experiences in other communities, they end up, maybe never coming back home. But the data, when we looked at this, also show that these communities are losing young people in motor vehicle crashes, many of which are preventable on these rural roads. So they're not leaving. And so, we have to address this issue. It's vitally important. I want to go to the opposite end of the spectrum for a second, and I apologize, the slide is a little bit fuzzy, but we also know older drivers are at high risk. Adults 65 and older make up about 19% of the rural population. That's also the total, rural population for the US. But when you look at the number that were killed in crashes between 2016 and 20, they accounted for about 21% of those individuals. And the overrepresentation may seem small, but we have to think about the graying of the United States rural population. There's real concern here. People 65 and older are the fastest growing segment of the rural population for a number of different reasons. And some, rural areas are attractive as retirement destinations, so retirees are moving in. In some areas, they're experiencing that out-migration of young residents so that the older adults become the proportionally larger population group. And these two particular trends have been really in place for a long, long time. More recently, death rates of rural middle-aged adults have risen, which again leaves those 65 and over as proportionally larger segments of the population. So the takeaway from this is really the graying of America, of rural America, is not expected to stop or reverse, which should absolutely be raising an alarm for the highway safety community all across the country. We need to be thinking about this and what do we need to do to really help these folks, particularly when you think about what other means of transportation do they have in rural communities other than driving. We also looked at distraction, and while it was not as significant as speeding or impairment by alcohol and drugs, as well as the age factor and the lack of seatbelt use, we know that of all fatalities that involve distraction, and I'm saying all fatalities, urban and rural, 46% took place on rural roads. And think about this for a minute. When drivers are bored, when they have to go long distances, they may be by themselves, they're going to look for some kind of stimulation or input. And it may not come from the radio. Rural drivers tend to be on those long trips, so they need to be 100% focused on what they're doing because these roads are often very unforgiving. I mentioned before that they don't have some of the safety features that urban roads or more or suburban or highways and others may have. So they really have to be paying attention to what they're doing. So we need to think about this issue of distraction and the fact that it is a factor in rural crashes for sure, and we must do more to address it. So let me stop for a minute there and just focus on some of the challenges that we identified. And when we think about this, rural communities, there is really a focus on self-reliance. And I think this is contributing to the part of the challenge of any underserved population. We have to rely on ourselves. We don't have necessarily a lot of resources. Things are far away. So we're going to take it into our own hands and do what we need to do. So there's definitely a challenge there. We also know that, rural trips are long. Long trips can be boring. Long trips can make things like speeding or distraction enticing. I might get there a little faster. I might pass the time, I'm not, as bored as I was. And long drives can also impact performance. We know the longer that we drive, there are definitely detriments to our skills. We get fatigued. Driving is a very fatiguing activity. It's also a complex task. So all of these things come into play. So, we also have a false sense of security on these roadways. And I point to something that I've heard over and over in my career, particularly working with parents of new young drivers. I've had many parents say to me, I don't want my teen to be driving on, city streets or on highways, multi-lane highways, because it's dangerous. I'd much rather have them be on those local country roads. There's less traffic and so forth. And I've had to remind them that there is this false sense of security that these roads, because there's less traffic, because they're 2-lane roads, they're somehow safer. But that's not necessarily the case. And we clearly see that from the data, and we see it in the data, particularly for young people. So we definitely have to think about, these challenges for sure. And I want to also take a minute to talk about limited resources. When we look at, the availability of resources, and I want to talk for a minute about on the safety side, public safety, and think about law enforcement. Many small towns across the country, rural communities, the average size of the law enforcement team is usually a couple of people, 2 people. And those individuals are not only tasked with traffic safety issues, but other things, crimes and so forth. And so they are the primary point of contact for all this. So their resources are limited. They may not have access to the training they need or the equipment they need. I also want to think for a minute about emergency response. Many of these folks who are working on emergency response teams in these communities, they're volunteers, right? They're taking time from their already busy days to do this work, and they may not have the most state-of-the-art equipment. They may not have the most readily available training that's going to help them in terms of their response. Telecommunications is a factor as well. Making sure that if you're out in a rural area that you can, call for help, that you can get the assistance you need. Is 911 going to be there? And where is the trauma center if you need, if you have, experienced a really significant crash and you need that medical care that is required from a trauma center. So these are all factors at play that we have to think about. And the report really digs into these things. So I encourage you to, look at it afterwards and really, kind of start thinking about, what is the role you play in this area? How can you help to address some of these challenges? And I will come back to them as we continue to go through the material here. All right, I'm trying to get my mouse to move for a minute. There we go. So I do want to take a minute and talk about this from the standpoint of, what do we do to address these issues? And we're all familiar with the safe system approach. I don't think I need to spend time talking about what it is, but I think it's important to say, to really point out that, this is not something, this is not an approach that just works in urban areas. This is an approach that absolutely can work in rural communities as well. When we think about the 5 elements and the 6 principles, all these things really align with the things that we uncovered in our research for this report. I really want to stress that, the behavioral piece is a strong part of this when we talk about the safe road users and the role they have. I want to, also point out that there's been strong support for enforcement, high visibility, equitable enforcement, and education programs in the safe system approach. I point you to another report that GHSA released last year on the safe system approach. I'm sorry, early at the beginning of this year on the safe system approach. And it really talks about the role of behavioral safety and how all those pieces fit together. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. But it really does talk about, how do we leverage this to move the needle? And I want to talk about it from the rural perspective. You've all probably seen this as well. This is the, called the Swiss cheese model, where we have those multiple layers of protection based on those elements and having them all work together. And when we looked at the factors involved with the crashes that were happening for rural road safety, we felt it was very clear that the elements of the safe system approach can be used to improve safety by mitigating the various risk factors. And I can't overstate that, because it's not just, okay, they crashed because they were speeding. They often crashed and they were speeding and they weren't wearing a seatbelt, or they were a young person who has that inexperience, that immaturity, they were going too fast for conditions, and maybe they had multiple passengers in the car. So we need to think about, again, how do we, leverage those multiple layers of protection that the safe system calls for when we think about improving safety in our rural roads. So I want to take a minute to talk about a few examples, and let me go the other way with the slides. Okay, one more. There we go. So I want to start with safer vehicles for a minute. And when we think about rural road safety, the two most common fatal crash types on rural roads are roadway departure and head-on collisions. And these two crash types occur more often on rural roads than on urban roads. When we think about roadway departure, it's about 57%, head-on collisions almost 63%. Is it all because of distraction? We don't know that. It could be alcohol, it could be impairment, it could be drowsy driving, it could be a combination of things. But we know that safety features, things like lane keeping assist, emergency braking, can absolutely help a driver on a rural road. So, the more we can do to encourage folks to take advantage of these new safety features if they're purchasing new cars. A lot of times in rural communities, the cars tend to be older. So as folks do think about, buying a new vehicle, the more we can do to educate them about these technologies and vehicles and to use them, to understand them is important. I know the state highway safety offices are, authorized to implement behavioral safety countermeasures and can focus on actions that individual drivers can take to improve their safety. So we are definitely, working with the states. We're encouraging them to think about how they can educate the public about these new technologies and how they can have an impact, on all roadway systems, but also particularly in the rural areas. But we know that, there's been a lot of survey work done showing that people don't understand this technology, that they often turn it off, they ignore it. So I think it's important that we have, some conversations about this in rural communities as folks are thinking about, new vehicles and so forth. Let me move on to another one. I want to talk about infrastructure as well. We do talk a little bit about this in the report. It's not, the focus of the report. There are lots of engineering countermeasures that can be used to prevent or mitigate crashes on rural roads. So I encourage folks to check out the Federal Highway Administration's repository of crash modification factors. They refer to it as CMF, that can provide an estimate of the change in crashes expected after they put a particular countermeasure in place. But there are some that I want to point to that I think we know have been incredibly effective. The enhanced delineation treatment, that's the chevron signs that you see on the top. It's on the top left of my screen. They alert drivers in the advance of a curve so they can slow down and take action. That's so important, and we know this is incredibly effective. It can reduce nighttime crashes by about 25% and non-intersection and fatal and injury crashes by about 16%. Down below that, you see rumble stripes and strips. They help prevent vehicles from crossing the center line, running off the road. Again, these are incredibly effective when they're installed on the shoulder or the edge line of the travel lane, or also at or near the center line of an undivided roadway. And a lot of these rural roads are undivided. The center line rumble strips absolutely reduce head-on, opposite direction, and side swipe and fatal injury crashes anywhere from about 44 to 64%. The rumble strips, they've definitely reduced single vehicle run off the road fatal and injury crashes by anywhere from 13 to 51%. And again, thinking about some of these rural areas where people run off the road, they're colliding with poles and trees and other stationary objects. So the more we can prevent this from happening, the better. On the bottom right is a safety edge. That's where they're shaping the edge of the pavement to eliminate that vertical drop off at the pavement edge, and that's going to allow drifting vehicles to get back up to the pavement safely. That treatment has been shown to reduce fatal and injury crashes by about 11%. And then the last I point to is the top right, which is the median barriers. They separate opposing traffic on a divided highway, and they redirect a vehicle to prevent that strike, right, in case they're crossing over. And median barriers have reduced fatalities on divided highways due to head-on crashes by about 8%, but the reduction increases to 97% for rural 4-lane roadways. So that's pretty amazing when you think about it. It really is. All right, so another example I want to talk about. We want to talk about enforcement coupled with public outreach when we think about the safer road user. I want to point to the photo on the left is from Ohio. They implemented the nation's first distracted driving safety corridor. The Ohio DOT used some of their Section 148 Highway Safety Improvement Program funds. They put signs up throughout the corridor, and one of these signs includes a counter that tells motorists the number of days that have gone on since a serious crash occurred. After they installed the signage, they did a big media campaign to increase public awareness. They also worked with the Department of Public Safety to increase enforcement. And the focus wasn't so much on issuing tickets, but really more about distributing information to drivers about risky behaviors. So during the first 2 years of the program, all crashes and then injury crashes declined 30 and 31% respectively. So really significant. The other thing I point to is this little logo you see on the right, which is Buckle Up, Phone Down. This is a program that started in Missouri. And Missouri is a state that does not have a primary seatbelt law. They also do not have a texting ban. So they are very challenged to really try to move the needle in this area. And it's really about education coupled with some social norming to move the needle. And they've made some great strides in this area in terms of creating public awareness about the danger of not buckling up and the danger of using your cell phone while driving. And it's been so, I would say, successful in creating awareness that it is now being evaluated by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Other states are looking at this program as something that they may want to emulate and try it out. So it's about social norming and really potentially changing behavior in a predominantly rural state. So we see great opportunity there. And last thing I want to mention on the safe system side is speed. We talked about speed and what's happening in rural crashes, fatal crashes. Lower speeds, impact the forces, right, that come into play in a crash. So we want to slow drivers down to lessen that impact. And we need to look at how do we do that. We need to understand that we need to send messages to the public. We do need high visibility enforcement does work. And so this is important. So I stress a couple of things here is if there's ways to give drivers feedback about their speeds, it can be challenging in rural areas, but I think it's not as challenging as trying to put officers out there on all these rural roads, oftentimes when they have miles and miles of roads to cover. So we really need to think about what we can do here. And there is some research showing that driver feedback signs do work. They get people to slow down. It makes a huge difference for sure. There's also some technology out there that's being piloted in Iowa to assess driver speeds using, again, some feedback and really coupling that with some outreach and education to engage with the public where officers are receiving information in their vehicles about speeds as these folks go by, and they can follow up with them and stop them and have a conversation with them about speeds and what's going on. So there's a lot of work happening in this area to focus on changing the dynamic around speeding. So when we think about the countermeasures that are in the report, we did focus on making sure that folks in local communities can take ownership of this issue. It's not always well received when the locals get a message from the state capitol saying, we know you got a problem and here's what you should do about it. We really recognize that communities want to understand their problems and often do know about their problems, but they don't necessarily have the data to paint a full picture. And so one of the things that we talk about in the report is to make sure that we're providing local data to help elected officials, law enforcement, community members really understand the full extent of their safety problem, and so that they can arm themselves with the information in a way that's easy to understand, that tells the story, if you will, so that they can then determine how best to address it. What resources did they need? Who can be of help, and so forth. What you see on the screen is from Missouri. They have a Safe Coalition website, and they have a data portal where folks can go in there and look at information for their county and really dig into this and understand what's going on. So I'm going to stop there. I've been blathering on for a while here, but I'm going to stop, and I want to turn this over to my colleague Andy to talk about what they're doing in Wisconsin to make data accessible to communities in a very easy to use format that I think is just fantastic. So Andy, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Thank you so much, Pam. I really appreciate that. And thanks everybody for joining us again. My name is Andy Bill. I think you should be able to see my screen here. So this is a tool that we developed in partnership with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation's Bureau of Transportation Safety. And it was started out as a way to help with those old PIN maps, right? So in Wisconsin, by state statute, we have to have every county must have a traffic safety commission that meets on a quarterly basis to review the crashes, the fatal crashes from the previous quarter. I'm sure we all can remember those maps in our office where with those little pins on it, but it was really hard to make sure we had those and could communicate those and kind of make it timely and accurate, thinking about the NHTSA 6-pack. So we originally started this as a way to be able to help inform those traffic safety commissions. They are a multidisciplinary, multi-jurisdictional group that gets together. Over time, we realized that if you build it, they will come, right? So the more we provided the data, the more people used it. And the more that we had it out there, we could have discussions about data quality, where we needed to go with different types of safe systems, and then being able to figure out what is the next steps. So here you can see just the regular tab here. This search tab that I have on right now is actually open to anybody and everybody. This is one that I use a lot when just customers call me up and say, I got a problem on my intersection. I can take a look at it. If I click on one of these dots here, you can see that it has the county, municipality, the on-at location, the date, severity, and then the flags. It doesn't give any personal identifying information. It doesn't have anything associated with that, but it just gives folks a flavor of what's out there. We do have different crash flags down here with a way of getting to the definitions. And you can think about that we've broken this up into our safe system as much, right? So we've got our bike flag, we've got our distraction impaired, motorcycle, occupant protection, speed, teen drivers, 65 plus, and work zones. And you can do an and or an or throughout this process. We have data going all the way back to 2001. So it's a great way to kind of have those conversations. As you know, with some of these maps, sometimes it can be quite unruly to look at it in dot form, right? So our eyes will kind of get accosted sometimes as we go through this and look at it. So, if I think about this map here, this isn't really telling us very much. We do have a clustering tool that can start to show us at a very high level where there are crashes happening. And so you can see in some of our other areas here. And every time I zoom in, that cluster tool is going to readjust. So it helps us kind of get to that place where we want to focus in on, and then we can go more in depth into the screening or the diagnoses. So this is just the search tool is open to anybody and everybody. And this was helpful and a good place, but as always, right, people wanted more, right? And that's great. So we moved on to the advanced tab, and this one is password protected. You can see up here that I've already logged in. And this is going to give us some more information, and I'll go through kind of what that is a little bit. So on the left, you can see I can do a little different location. I can break it down by our regions or counties or even our municipalities. I can do the different jurisdictions and the agencies. So if I wanted to look specifically at one law enforcement compared to another, I could. I can do different date ranges. If I want to just compare February and March of this year to the past 5 years, I can do that here as well to be able to look and kind of compare a little bit. You'll see now that I have a little bit more crash flags associated with it, and then I even have even more, right? So as always, we keep adding these. The crash flags correspond to the safe system as well as to our strategic highway safety plan, to our emphasis areas. And we wanted to kind of make sure we keep looking at those. As I mentioned before, putting data into the hands of especially our law enforcement really helps with the data quality too. So they can be like, well, I was out there at that crash scene and I know that it was supposed to be speed related. Why isn't it showing up here as speed related? And then we go back to how we look at how we classify it as speed, and it's not there. And so we can kind of have that data quality discussion throughout that process. what's also interesting here is that we can look at adding other layers to the crash database. So what it was always interesting here in Wisconsin is that we have a lot more ATVs on our roadways. And in the state of Wisconsin, the ATV crashes, if they do not involve a motor vehicle in transport, it is not on our crash database. It is actually through the Department of Natural Resources. And so there was always this idea of, man, we need to know what's happening on a roadway. If we're going to think about a safe system, we need to think about everything that's on our roadways, not just what's a motor vehicle and transport. And so we said, how do we pull this data in? So for right now, I can turn on these flags and I can kind of look to see where they are. There's some basic information in here. So if I was an agency and I wanted to go back to the DNR, I could ask them for this document number and get some more. But it gives us some basic information here. And then what's nice is here I can look at this and then I can toggle on the crash data that we do have for ATVs. And I will do, so I did 2019 through 2022. So I will do that same date range here. It's always the fun part of doing a live demo. You get to see me type and mess up throughout the process. And I can search that. So it'll be coming up here. So I will have the DNR, which is these little kind of gray lines here. And then you can also see the fatalities associated with those ATV crashes. And so we can kind of look to see where there's trends and where we need to look at, is this education experiment? Do we need to think about our engineering, what's set up on the roadways and our weather conditions and other things of that sort? With the advanced tab, I also have a little bit more information that goes with it. So here now you can see that not only does it have the on and the at, but it gives that municipality, it gives the crash hour, all of the flags associated with it. So for this fatal flag, there was a pedestrian that was also involved, a teen driver, an ATV crash, and a lane departure of 2+ vehicles. 2 units, I should say, and then that's the unit would be the pedestrian on that side. And then it was a side swipe opposite direction, and those coordinate information. Bear with me for 1 second because I just want to show you the other thing is when I click on that, you got a white screen for a second, and then I'm going to show you here. So being able to link right from there, we're able to get to the crash report form. I'm not going to show you all the pages just because there is some personal identifying information, which is why this has to be behind a password protection. But right here on the first page, it gives you the diagram and it gives you the narrative. So very quickly, you could go through and review crash report forms, review the data quickly and easily, hopefully, through that process. Let me go back to our community maps here. So one question you might have is, well, Andy, how do I get access to the password protected side of the house? And this is open to anybody within law enforcement and anybody within local government and anybody almost even doing work with local government. So we're trying to make it as open as possible through that. The other question I get was, well, what about the data? How quickly is the data in the system? Our crash reporting is 100% electronic, so every agency in Wisconsin is reporting electronically. If the crash data is submitted yesterday, it'll be available to be reviewed today. So there's no kind of lag associated with that and kind of looking through that. So we're looking at, we tried to address the timeliness issue that we were hearing from folks. We tried to address the accessibility issue that we were hearing from folks. And then, the data quality, right? And so being able to have those discussions through that process and looking at it. This was, again, a good tool. It was really helpful in these Traffic Safety Commission meetings where we want to go more in depth and look at it. I have the ability to, because it's built in Google Earth, I can zoom in here. So let me zoom into this location here where we see a DNR crash and a fatal crash right near each other. Because it's Google Maps, I can also drag the little peg man, as he's named, down into it. And so then I can take a look at the roadway right from here. So from my desk, I could help a local agency and say, okay, we see some issues here. Let's look. Do we, and I'd say, okay, well, is there a sight distance issue? Do we have some, sorry, that's a little too fast. Do we have some gravel road issues that we need to address and look at? Are there options for proven safety countermeasures that Pam talked about with the safety edge or others coming through here. And so you can see here very easily, you can see that there's probably a sight distance issue with this vertical curvature. It doesn't mean that it's exactly out there. There still needs to be a field visit to take a look at it, but at least gives us a start to have that as initial discussions through that process. So we found that this was helpful for the traffic safety commissions, local agencies. Law enforcement said, okay, this is great, but we want to know, are we enforcing in the correct location? And how do we look at this in an easier way? And so we then developed another tool because, why not? We developed what's called predictive analytics here, and I'm going to focus on more of our rural area. So I'm going to do our north central region of the state. I'm going to still analyze it over the last 3 years. I can change all of these. I can change it to first or second shift or the next 3 days or 7 days. So if I'm looking at allocating resources, I can do that. But then going back to what Pam talked about, let's take those teen drivers and speed. And so I'm going to go ahead and click both of those fields in there, and I'm going to apply this. It is going to come up with a heat map first, which is helpful. But for some law enforcement, they said, I don't really know, like, okay, so all of Wausau or all of Stevens Point you want me to go to? Where specifically should I be looking at? And so the algorithm in the back comes up with these analysis areas, and you can change how these analysis areas are filtered. And that's a whole other presentation. I can talk about this for hours, but for just an interest of time here, I can zoom in here to area 2 and look at it a little bit more carefully here. So you can see it's right around this kind of busy interchange area between 2 major state highways. It's about 2 miles. We've got teen drivers, we've got speeds. We also have some older drivers, impaired, distraction, occupant protection, and aggressive as well. As Pam mentioned, it's not just one factor, right? These are overlaying factors, and we want to make sure that we are looking at those together. So then you can start to say, okay, well, if I was going to allocate resources, maybe I'm doing a circuit around in this area to cover all of these hotspots, and you can look at those days and times associated with it. So it was a way to look at resource allocation and then being able to evaluate afterwards how things were going. Are we reducing the crashes that we want to be reducing? And how is that performing and looking at it? We will continue to add more layers over time and pulling in citations and warnings and hospital records as well too. But this at least gives us the building blocks to be able to get the data out there. We do quarterly meetings with our with anybody that wants to come to learn more about community maps, and so to get that data out there. And then we also have a resources tab, right? So we have the data, but sometimes it's overwhelming to look at the data. And one thing I want to focus on here is this kind of county profiles that gets put out on a yearly basis. And so it just starts here with an introduction about what it is, what are the trends. It talks about the safe system approach, and then it just shows you kind of in pictorial form how many people are involved in crashes. 6 out of 10 fatal and injury crashes occur on county or state roadways, and then gets into some of the other data with it. So what time of day, what day of week, what is the type of roadway so that we're looking on. So it's not a full local road safety plan because it doesn't go into great detail about roadways and things of that sort, but it gives you a start for those local road safety plans to say, where should we be focusing on? So then it covers kind of each one of the emphasis areas from the strategic highway safety plan here. So you can see it as it drops down. And looking at it, I'm just going to keep scrolling through here. How does Adams County compare to other, statewide with regards to distraction? So Adams is a very rural county. You'll see some of the same trends that Pam talked about here through that process: bike and safety, motorcycle safety, and this tab is open to anybody and everybody as well too. So feel free to go take a look at these resources. Trying to scroll down without making you guys dizzy to the last one here. And then it gets into, what VMTs are out there, what grants have been out there. So others can start to take a look to say, well, maybe if I'm from the Dells PD, why haven't I been involved in any of these grants? Maybe we should be, and kind of looking at those. And then kind of that injury to fatality report. So getting into some of our Department of Health Services records as well too, to be able to look at it. So again, trying to pull that data together at a high level to be able to start this process. So this community maps, it links to a bunch of different other information here, was a way to start creating a toolbox for any level of government to use, to be able to, or any type of local government, to be able to say, where are my problems, and then how do we fix it? And we want to make sure that we think about this as terms of, it's not just us in our individual silos. Sometimes we have to be creative. Sometimes we need to be reaching out to our schools, our sports teams that are out there in our rural areas, our car dealerships that are out there, to let the folks know about some of those safety features and things of that sort. And here we have the data to start that process through. So I think my 15 minutes are up here. So Pam, I appreciate this. Hopefully this gives folks just a sense of how to look at the data and visualize it to get to other folks, and I'll be around to answer any questions as we go.
That was great, Andy. Thank you. It was really great. Jamie, do we want to take questions for a minute, or are we going back in?
I do. I'd like to do some questions. We have quite a few that came in for you. And so there's a few that came in on the statistics up front. One of those is, how was impact speed calculated?
How is impact speed calculated? I don't know that I can answer that right off the top of my head right now, but I can get, if you share that person's info with me, I can follow up with them individually.
Will do.
Okay, appreciate that.
Yep. The next question was, did you confirm the fatal crashes in those states occurred on their 70, 75, and 80 mile per hour roads, or did the data research not get into those details on the speeds?
I'm not sure I understand what they're asking. Say that again. I apologize.
Again, I believe this was about the high speeds on the rural roads, the higher ones. They're wondering if it was confirmed that those fatal crashes were on the highest speeds of them, the 70, 75, and 80 mile per hour, and whether or not you guys were able to get into the detail of confirming that for each of the states, or if you used more general data.
It was more general data, and what we looked at was the rate of speed-related crashes in the states, and then compared them to, the speed limits. Where were we seeing the most speed-related fatal crashes, and then looked at what are the set speeds, the top speeds, and did it that way. So if I encourage them to go back and take a look at the report in that section specifically, and again, if they have additional questions and want to dig deeper, I can certainly help, and we can also pull our researchers from Toxel to answer some of those real in-depth questions. Okay.
Perfect. And here's one more on speed. And again, not sure if you'll be able to answer this on the fly, but this one is, what is the relationship between vehicle speeds and speed differential regarding crashes?
I can't answer that one either. So I think we'll take these offline, and we'll dig into them, and we'll get back to these folks, or we'll make that connection with the researchers. How's that?
Sounds perfect.
Okay.
Let's see. So this one is for Andy, and it is any entity collecting data specifically involving farm equipment and passenger vehicles, or drivers going off-road to avoid slow-moving vehicles or motorist crashes?
Yeah, so by our definition in the state of Wisconsin, if there is a motor vehicle that's in transport, whether or not it hits that slow-moving farm equipment or not, if it crashes, then it will be on our database. So we do have that data. We would just need to look at it by CMV. We have a CMV ag standpoint, and then we also have just kind of a non-listed unit for some of those tractors that aren't licensed by it. If a tractor unfortunately hits a pedestrian or a bicyclist, and that tractor isn't licensed by the DMV, we wouldn't have that in our database. So it kind of just, unfortunately, the devil's in the detail on some of these, but we do have a lot of it, but not necessarily all of it.
A couple other additional questions about the data that you are showing. One is, did the data take place on paved or non-paved roads? So are you able to provide both of those in your database, or just one or the other?
Go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
So for our roads here in Wisconsin, we have almost all of them are paved roads. We have very few gravel roads, but we do have the data for any crash that occurs on a roadway involving a motor vehicle in transport.
And then another question that came in about your web app as well was, what additional health or hospital data do you plan to incorporate in the future?
So much, right? You can't see me doing my evil finger thing here. Not that it's evil, but no. One thing we want to look at is how do we understand, exactly which hospital they went to. So is there, as Pam mentioned, because of just the distance between Trauma One hospitals and some of these locations, are we, where was the crash? Where was the hospital? Where was the emergency room? Did they have to get transferred? So are there ways that we can look at some of those kind of linkages through that process? We always want to look at the injury severity that the medical professionals put on the person versus law enforcement, because it's just two different eyes looking at the same thing. So we want to look and compare about that, as well as then starting to look at filling in some of the other data that we may be missing, such as toxicology or other data that is going to be collected on the medical side, but not having in the crash report form.
And then one last question, I guess, that came in for you is the crash map that you showed, or the web platform. Is it possible for it to get licensed or copied for other areas?
Probably. That's a great question. You can send me their contact information and I can work with them.
Okay.
Perfect.
You. And then a lot of the other questions that came in, Pam, are more on countermeasures, which I know you're about to talk about a little bit, so we can hold off on those questions until after you've done that part of the presentation.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Not sure if I have control of the screen again. We need to go back to the slide that I was last on, which was that data slide. There it is. Okay, so we'll move on from here. Okay, I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about some countermeasures. But again, I really encourage everyone who was kind enough to join us today to dig into the report. There's a lot more, there's much more detail than I'm going to be able to give you today. But so this is just really kind of a flavor. I'm hoping to whet your appetite so that you'll say, I've got to get that report and I've got to look at it and I've got to start talking to my partners out there. So I'll talk just briefly about seatbelts and child passenger safety seats. I want to talk about both. We know that, the most effective thing we can do is enact seatbelt laws, child seat laws and seatbelt laws in our states. And we still have 16 states without primary enforcement of a seatbelt requirement. And, we can't overstate how difficult it is to enforce secondary laws. It is really vital. So this is an area where we do need to focus on this, and it's really going to take all of us to continue to put pressure on our state houses to get this done. You saw that the little graphic or the icon I shared with you from Missouri for their Buckle Up, Phone Down program, which is social norming, thinking about, how can we pilot non-enforcement campaigns using social norms and social media. We really think that there's an opportunity there, and it's not, we talk about we need primary seatbelt laws, but we also recognize where we don't have them, how can we get the public to think about doing this? And it's interesting, people say to me all the time, everybody buckles up. Well, it's very obvious that not everybody buckles up, and if we could get, those 58% of those fatalities that involved unbelt folks buckled up, think about how many lives we can save. So we've got to use all these different tactics. I can't overstate, you saw what Andy shared, supplying that local data to those high-risk jurisdictions, providing technical assistance, helping them understand, what is going on with this lack of belt use, and really focusing on that issue is important. And also bringing child passenger safety technician training to rural communities. We talk about an example in the report where North Carolina mapped their child passenger safety technician locations and determined where they had big gaps geographically. So they literally brought training to as many places as possible. And now they have technicians trained in every county in their state. So there's ways to do this to move the needle. When we think about solutions for alcohol and other drugs, we really think first and foremost about how can jurisdictions, these rural communities, share resources, share personnel, expertise, and equipment. Maybe it's a multi-jurisdictional sobriety check type event, and maybe it moves around. There may be some resources that can be made available. DREs, I can't overstate the importance of having folks trained to do that and have maybe call out programs where DREs can be made available around the state, because we know it's difficult to send somebody for DRE training. It's time intense and it's expensive. So thinking about how to provide training for rural tribal law enforcement, taking the training to those entities, it's important. And then improving testing for drugs as well as alcohol. Very, very important. It's very expensive to have the equipment necessary to do some of this work. But if there is a way to centralize that, we strongly encourage states to think about this to better serve the rural communities. So I want to stop there again, and I want to bring my colleague and friend Pete into the discussion here to talk from a law enforcement perspective about what the work he's been doing in Wyoming, which is a very rural state, and the challenges that he has been working to overcome. So Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you for about 15 minutes.
Okay, good morning, Pam, and thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can, Pete.
Okay, and I also want to take the center for involving me in this today. It's an honor and a privilege, and also Pam and GHSA, it was also a privilege to be part of the report and the panel at the conference this year. So I've seen some really good presentations this morning, and I'd like to touch on a few things that both you and Andy talked about, but let's get a quick background here of what the LEL program is and what an LEL does. And I'll premise that by saying is, not all LELs are alike. It's a different arrangement of cats and dogs. So I'll just touch on a few of the highlights and some of the things that we all share in common as LELs. So first and foremost, what an LEL's job is to do is to reduce crashes and save lives, and that's a big topic. But essentially, we're the bridge from the most highway safety offices to law enforcement in that state. And most of us are retired law enforcement. Most of us have backgrounds in traffic enforcement, A-ride instructors, impaired driving enforcement, and things of that nature. So principally, our value to the highway safety offices is taking the messaging and the data and the resources that those offices have and distributing those throughout the agencies in basically a personal and one-on-one fashion. So we do that through a variety of ways. We foster engagement through one-on-one visits with these agencies. And when I sit down and visit with an agency, I'm doing several things. First of all, I'm getting their information and their contact information because I'm responsible for maintaining a database of all the agencies in the state. And that's really helpful when it comes time to, if there's changes in our electronic reporting systems, if driver services has an updated form or something like that. Oftentimes it's our job to make sure that that new information is passed on to these agencies. Reports and data. In our visits periodically, at least once a year, I furnish agencies and their administrators with a hard copy of their crash data for over the last 5 years. It's 4, 5, 6, 7 pages long, but it's something that they can hold in their hand and sort of peruse, because despite how well we do presenting or gathering and presenting data like we saw in Andy's presentation, oftentimes, I'll tell you, that's the easy part. The easy part is doing the temporal and the heat maps and deciding what the causes are and what times to do the enforcement and what to do the enforcement on. And I think my friends in the room who are familiar with law enforcement will all agree with me. The easy part is gathering the data and presenting it. The hard part is getting buy-in from leadership and agencies to begin to think about what that data means and how best to deploy their resources at an operational and even a tactical level, to be in those times and places when crashes are most likely to occur for whatever reason and do high visibility enforcement there. And that's a pretty easy thing for me to roll off my tongue because I've said it so many times, but the reality of it is it's very difficult to convince a lot of folks in law enforcement that that's what they need to do. It's very difficult to convince them that, data and deploying your resources smartly with those limited resources to reduce crashes and reduce injuries and save lives is the way to go and should be the priority in any agency. Once a year, at least I illustrate this in my outreach program with my agencies. And when I say my agencies, I'll give it some scale. Wyoming has, give or take on any day, because it does fluctuate, about 82 law enforcement agencies in the state. I'm in contact with all of them, and that's a range from federal, BIA, for example, to the State Highway Patrol, to all our sheriff's offices and police departments. Over 200 folks that I network within the state that I share this information with. But you got to form a relationship with these agencies. You have to show that you're sincerely interested in their success. And what I do is illustrate to them, for example, how many homicides we have on average in our state, as opposed to how many people we kill on our roadways every year. And would it surprise anybody if I told you that in my state, over the last probably 10 years, we kill 10 times as many people on our highways as we do through violent means? So if law enforcement is truly following these Pelian principles and out there to reduce crime and increase public safety and fear of crime, then we've got to be out there directly engaged in active high visibility enforcement in the areas where it matters, right? We're all familiar with fishing holes, as we used to call them, maybe low traffic roadways where people are encouraged to speed, but however, have very few crashes. It's a great place to go write a speeding ticket and enforce the speeding law and do some roadside education. But the reality of it is we're better suited deploying ourselves in those, for example, intersections that have higher volume of traffic and higher volume of crashes. That's just one example. But when you partner with law enforcement, one of the important things to do is to show that the state is interested in their success, and we're interested in their safety and well-being. And what better ways to make that clear to our partners than to localize training in your areas for a couple of things. Two marquee programs that I push very strongly with law enforcement and other first responders in the state is something called Below 100, which is a program that was established years ago. It has tenets essentially reminding our law enforcement partners to do things as simple as wear your belt, wear your vest, watch your speed. I feel obligated, because of my history in law enforcement and the work that I do, to first and foremost protect those that are doing the job that I no longer get to do. And so we do that one of the ways we do that is we do a 4-hour post-certified class called Below 100, which I partnership with the Highway Patrol. They provide the instructors for me, and we sit down with law enforcement and we do this 4-hour class, essentially reminding them of all the tools they have, especially the one between their ears, to keep themselves safe and protected at all times. The other program that I push localized training in is what's called traffic incident management. Most of you are familiar with it. It's a 4-hour responder learning course, again, post-certified. I just recently set up a one-day course here in Casper, where I'm based out of, to teach a 4-hour block of traffic incident management and a 4-hour block of Below 100 to law enforcement specifically within the jurisdictions that happen to be here in Casper, and we happen to be the second largest county in the state. So I'm able to foster relationships and show these agencies how important they are to our overall goal of saving lives by, first of all, doing the best we can to protect them in their jobs every day. Another way we do that is through DDACs, and we've already seen Andy's presentation, and basically when I see a presentation like Andy's, what I'm looking at is DDACs. These are temporal maps that are telling me where crashes are occurring and when they're occurring and what the reasoning is. Now, DDACs, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is data-driven approaches to crime and traffic safety. This is it's a model of police management and a philosophy that says simply this: use your data to deploy your resources to reduce crime and crashes. It sounds great. It looks awesome on paper. And Andy's given us a good example of that. But the hardest thing to do in any law enforcement agency is to implement DDACs from the top to the bottom and the bottom of the top, and get the buy-in and make sure there's accountability in that department at all levels, that those officers, deputies, and troopers, when they are on their discretionary time, which is a fancy word of saying when an officer or a deputy or a trooper is not on a call, not at court, not otherwise busy doing law enforcement, and essentially can use that time to go somewhere, to be visible, and to make an impact on crime and traffic safety in that area. And that, believe it or not, is a very difficult thing to do. It's a management and it's a leadership issue. So I challenge my law enforcement leaders and my law enforcement management to attend the DDAX training, which is, it's a day and a half, it's free. I think we've done 5 or 6 of them in Wyoming over the last few years, and some of our larger agencies and in fact some of our mid-level agencies are beginning to pick up on it and beginning to implement it. And in my vision, if I could get every law enforcement agency in this state to dedicate themselves to operating smartly, using data and deploying their resources in such a manner, I think I would be out of a job in a few years, and I would be happy. I would welcome that. So those are just a few of the high points that I wanted to hit this morning and share with our counterparts out there. And with that being said, just one more note. Pretty much all LELs are program managers on some scale or level, and some of us have oversight of these HVE grants for occupant protection and impaired driving, for example. We should all be familiar with that. We're also the recruiters. It's our job to recruit agencies to get them to join, so that we can strengthen those bonds and share information to reduce crashes and injuries in their area. And we handle recruiting and retention on that as well, as I think I mentioned. But I think I've gone on with most of the bullet points that I wanted to cover here today. And for those of you out there who have any questions for me or the rest of the panel, I'll be happy to assist.
Thank you, Pete, very much. Jamie, I'm going to quickly go through like one more slide, 2 slides for countermeasures, and then I think I'll toss it back to you for questions. Does that work?
That sounds perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Real quick, I want to talk about young drivers in terms of countermeasures. And this is an area, as I said, I've worked in this field for a long, long time. It's near and dear to my heart, but we really need to think about expanding our programs to include drivers through age 24. So rather than call them teen driving programs, I think young drivers or young adult driver programs are really critical, something to be said for the nomenclature. And that means that we've got some really active peer-to-peer programs. Peer-to-peer programs work as part of a broader environmental strategy. We have FCCLA and SAD chapters in many, many rural communities, many rural high schools across the country. We need to think about how do we expand those to engage these young people who really are dynamos as they go off to college or technical school or even out into the workforce, so that they can really help carry that message. And I point to a program in Texas. There's a program called Teens in the Driver's Seat. It is a year-round, fully youth-led program that works with students in junior and senior high schools. Very, very active in 40 states, but they also have a college edition called U, the letter U as in university, in the driver's seat that's active in the state of Texas on about 22 college and university campuses. They've got over 500 students who are engaging with their peers, almost 300,000 peers. So we need to think about, how can we keep this opportunity going with these young folks who can do a tremendous job of helping with social norming and really leading on this issue in our rural communities. A couple other things. I really stress, the idea of looking at your local data. I love what Andy's doing in Wisconsin, the portal they've built. Use that local data to educate policymakers about some very dangerous loopholes in our graduated driver's licensing laws. Really dig into the data and provide that information specific to legislators' districts. Help them understand what's happening for their youngest voting bloc, if you will, in their communities and their parents, and how we need to continue to strengthen our graduated driver's licensing laws. We have not solved the problem. We are still losing teens every day, and obviously disproportionately in rural areas and young adults. So we need to focus on strengthening policy. And we also need to educate parents and young drivers about, as I mentioned before, those risks on rural roads. Rural roads can be incredibly unforgiving. So we need to kind of clarify that sense of they think it's much safer to put their young person on that more rural, less trafficked roadway. I've already talked about distraction, but I just want to recap this a little bit. Thinking about partnering with your DOT to minimize crash severity through some of these infrastructure improvements. Love safety cameras to get that feedback that can be related to distraction. There's companies that can put cameras out there that actually can detect that person using a phone behind the wheel and send a message up ahead, to put your phone down kind of thing. Those feedback signs for speeding work, we think they can also be effective for distraction. We love the safety corridors program that's happening in Ohio, and that could be expanded. And then also thinking about social norming, and I mentioned also, you see the little graphic there from Idaho, where they have a social norming program in place that focuses on using a Sasquatch, which is a commonly known character in the state of Idaho. So the last thing I'll do just to wrap it up is I mentioned the challenges after I talked about the data, and we talk about limited resources and those distances people have to travel. And again, that false sense of security, these local roads are safer, but they are more unforgiving. We no doubt about it, because they do not have some of the safety features, and there are these long stretches where there isn't necessarily anyone around, or it's longer for emergency response. So what do we do about it? And really, it's about sharing resources, bringing training locally. And you heard Pete talk about the work he does in Wyoming to take the training to the police departments and agencies that he works with, and sharing of resources, to make sure that departments and communities and EMS and others have what they need. Providing that information to dispel some of those beliefs that may be held in local communities, but that information has to be delivered by folks that are authentic voices in that community. It can't be the state house necessarily, or folks in the state capitol bringing this message in from it. It can be delivered to folks who can then take that message, who are part of the community, to convey that information. And lastly, think about, because the roads can be so unforgiving, and we think about multiple risk factors, how do we separate the risk? That means, leveraging that safe system approach with that Swiss cheese effect of, multiple layers. So I will stop there and put up that slide that has the report one more time, so you can get the link to access it. And I really hope that you will dig into it. We're very proud of the report. We think it really does help frame the discussion, but also has tons and tons of ideas in it to help move the needle, where all of us in all the different disciplines can be working together. So Jamie, I toss it back to you.
Perfect, thank you. And we do have quite a few questions that came in, but we only have time for just a few. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask these. The first one is for Andy again, and that was the maps creation that you talked about. Was it part of a larger Wisconsin DOT effort to share data with local agencies? And how was it funded?
Yeah, so great question. So the community maps was funded originally through traffic records coordinating, so $405 on that part of it. And it was a way to help get data more timely and more accurate by being able to provide it that way. Did I cover all the questions? Okay.
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. And then we have a question that came in for Pete as well. And someone was sharing that in their community, their police don't actively pursue traffic safety violations. And so they're wondering if there's a way to get the local police department to care more about traffic safety, what some suggestions you might make would be.
I would say good luck with that. Hearing that sort of news makes me wonder, then what will we have law enforcement do if they're not out there enforcing traffic laws? And that's a sad fact. Look, we're seeing this you know, with you know, crime being an issue in so many of our communities across the country, and disengagement with law enforcement. And, you know, it's a sad state of affairs, and it's a leadership failure on so many levels. You know, I wouldn't want to be part of an agency that was that disengaged to their public. They're not serving anybody's best interest when they're not making traffic stops. And I realize that's coming from leadership and political pressure, but, you know, sometimes you just gotta bear down. You got to do your job, and you got to do what's right. And other than providing them with the information that DDACS has, and the numerous case studies that have been done that tell everybody, this has been proven time and time and again, that traffic enforcement is law enforcement. Okay, by engaging the public on the roadways in a proactive and polite and equitable manner, you're stopping criminals, you're removing you know, illegal substances off the roadway, you're enforcing suspensions, you're doing all these sorts of things that not only help reduce crashes and fatalities and injuries, but also reduce crime in those areas. And that's, unfortunately, that is a reality in America today. I've seen that on a very, very small, limited level in my state. But all you can do is provide them with the information that shows them, you know, if you're not going to be out there making traffic stops, then prepare yourself for doing a few more auto burglary reports and vandalism reports and all those other sorts of crimes that would accompany any agency who decides to step away from their responsibilities and not enforce the traffic laws.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pete. And I think many of the other comments that are coming in are just saying how great this overview is that you guys did today and gave Pam, and how they're excited to look at the report more fully. And so, as Pam mentioned earlier, there are a lot more case studies that are directed in the actual report. I've posted the link to the report in the chat pod. It's also showing on the screen right now. I did also post the link to the GHSA Safe System report that Pam mentioned, as well as to the public version of the Wisconsin data tool in the chat pod, in case anyone's interested in that too. And one more time, you can download the handout, which shows the slides for today, along with all of these links. That's available over on the right-hand side of your screen as well. So we're going to go ahead and get wrapped up with today's presentation. Just a few slides left for you all. So our learning outcomes, again, today you learned about some rural road crash statistics and leading crash causation factors. There's many more that are available in the report itself. The unique challenges faced by rural areas, some examples of proven countermeasures and promising practices used in rural areas, and the report has a lot of resource links available in it to show you where some of the case studies and examples and countermeasures came from. We also heard from Andy about Wisconsin's data portal and community mapping feature, and we heard from Pete about the law enforcement liaison program and what they do to engage their rural LELs to decrease rural fatalities. A couple of announcements for you all. Our December webinar, the date is still to be announced, but we're believing that it will be during Older Driver Awareness Week, because we will be doing a webinar on older driver safety. So we'll announce that as soon as we have the date available. This week is Crash Responder Safety Week, so we hope that you'll all join us in posting on social media about this. You can find out more at the link shown on your screen right now. On November 20th is World Day of Remembrance for Road Traffic Victims. So again, there's some information on the website for that about how you can participate. And then December 5th through 9th will be the Older Driver Safety Awareness Week that I was mentioning. I also want to let you know that the Road to Zero through the National Safety Council has opened the applications for their community traffic safety grants, and you can find more on their website that's showing right now on the screen. It would be great to see some rural applications submitted for these community traffic safety grants. And with that, I'm going to leave you with the screenshots of the emails for all of our presenters. For those of you that added in questions that we said we'd follow up on, we will make sure to provide your contact information to our speakers so they can reach back out to you. We appreciate you all joining us today, and thank you to Pam, Andy, and Pete for sharing their expertise with us today, and we hope you'll check out that GHSA report. Thank you all and have a great day.
Okay, buddy. You there? Hey,
Pete, we can still hear you.
I'm sorry. I had to take a phone call real quick.